look at an initiative that was just passed here in Washington State relating to gun ownership. Changes to gun ownership and purchase requirements measure I-1639 was passed on November 6, 2018. So the initiative was designed to implement restrictions on the purchase and ownership of firearms. Restrictions include background checks, storage requirements, waiting periods, as well as increasing the minimum age to buy semi-automatic rifles to 21. So a lot of this is pretty standard fare for what we've been seeing the push lately. The particularly concerning component of this law are the new firearm storage requirements. So, under the measure, a person who left a firearm in a place where a prohibited person, someone who is prohibited from firearm possession under state or federal law, could potentially gain access to the firearm would be guilty of community endangerment, a Class C felony, if a prohibited person gained access to the firearm. So this could be a situation somebody breaks into your house and then steals the firearm. It could even be, you've passed this law where it's someone under the age of 21 and they're going to make the owner of the firearm responsible for the behavior of someone who is unlawfully using their property. Somebody breaks into your home, somebody breaks in wherever, and confiscates your property. You are now the felon. So it's a very strange law. And then there's an additional requirement to highlight this change. So every place where firearms are sold is required to display the following sign: in block letters, capitalized, and at least 1 inch in height. Warning: you may face criminal prosecution if you store or leave an unsecured firearm where a person who is prohibited from possessing firearms can and does obtain possession. Again, this is a very bizarre law. That the idea that someone steals your property from you and you are the one responsible. You are the felon. You wouldn't see this, for example, with a car or a truck. If somebody takes your car and uses it to rob a bank, the owner who was the victim, who had his car stolen, is not responsible for how the machine or the property is then used. You wouldn't see this with a baseball bat. You don't see this with anything else. This is just specifically kind of tied in with this moral panic involving firearms. So as is always useful, I wanted to look at where did the money come from? Who financed it, and where was the actual support? There was one committee registered to support the initiative, Safe Schools, Safe Communities. They reported a total of $5.5 million in contributions and $5.6 million in expenditures. The top donor was Paul Allen, this guy, who gave a total of $1.25 million. So Allen had cancer. He was diagnosed in 2009, and it was treated until 2018, which ultimately caused his death by septic shock on October 15, 2018. So he did not live to see this bill pass, but we can see the top donators. Paul Allen was a Microsoft graduate, so to speak. Nicholas Hanauer and Leslie Hanauer, they both donated $600,000, and Steve Ballmer and his wife Connie Ballmer, a couple other Microsoft alumni here, both donated $500,000. So big money coming from a handful of rich millionaires, billionaires driving this law. So the 4 committees who were registered to oppose the measure: Save Our Security, the NRA, Mary's Pistols, and Stop 1639, sponsored by Shall Not Be Infringed. Together, the committees raised $763,000 and spent $949,000. So we have about $1 million to $5.5 million. You have a spending difference of about 5 times as much money was spent on getting this passed. And prominent supporters for this was the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, the Washington Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, and these organizations here: Our Revolution, that advocates for the policies of U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, the Newtown Action Alliance, the Temple D. Hirsch Sinai, March for Our Lives Seattle, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, Moms Rising, Greater Seattle Business Association, Planned Parenthood Votes Northwest and Hawaii, Washington Education Association, the League of Women Voters, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence. So there's a lot of the organizational and financial support that this bill had. Some of the counter-arguments provided are: it removes rights from law-abiding adults. 18 to 20-year-olds are responsible enough to vote, purchase a home, and serve in our military, where, of course, they would get full auto weapons. They want you to believe these same adults can't be trusted to defend themselves or their families. And they're trying to use the crimes as a few as justification to curtail the rights of hundreds of thousands of Washingtonians. 1639 makes firearms unavailable for self-defense. 1639 would require gun owners to lock up their firearms or face criminal charges. This strict mandate renders firearms useless in self-defense situations by requiring them to be locked up. The United States Supreme Court invalidated a similar law as a violation of the Second Amendment, but I-1639's proponents are nonetheless seeking to create this unconstitutional requirement. It will not impact crime. Handguns, not rifles, are used in the majority of crimes. Targeting rifle ownership will only restrict law-abiding adults from accessing them for self-defense. This is another extreme Seattle agenda that fails to improve safety. It's bankrolled by a handful of Seattle billionaires, okay, we saw that above, that are more concerned with pushing California failed-style gun control than finding real solutions to make our schools and communities safe. And that is interesting. There's nothing there about making the schools safer. It's just curtailing and making it more burdensome to exercise your rights. I mean, imagine if they did this with free speech. If you had to get a license for free speech, if you couldn't have free speech till you were 21, if you couldn't, your free speech had to be kept within your home. It's perfectly fine. You just got to keep your speech locked up safely within your house. Let's see. 1639 is not about assault weapons. 1639 targets all semi-automatic rifles, including hunting rifles and target shooting rifles. These are not fully automatic military-grade weapons. They're commonly owned rifles for self-defense, home protection, and hunting. 1639 places Washingtonians at risk by restricting access to firearms for lawful self-defense, while doing nothing to increase security in schools or target violent criminals. In fact, they're targeting legal gun owners, law-abiding gun owners, by making them responsible for the actions of violent criminals. So there is a lawsuit, and it's been filed by the NRA and the Second Amendment Foundation against Attorney General Bob Ferguson. And it was filed on November 15, 2018, and they allege it violates the right to bear arms and wrongly regulates interstate commerce. And so they're challenging the provisions. Particularly weak is probably the increased age requirement. And so they've sought to have the above-mentioned provisions ruled unconstitutional and block enforcement of the entire measure. Now you can see here the yes vote. They did take it 59% to 40% by about 600,000 votes. And this is a tactic the left has used for a long time. It's called incrementalism. They start with bump stocks, or they start with adjustable stocks, or threaded barrels, or 30 round capacity magazines, and they just whittle away at your rights. This makes it so that you pretty much have to keep a gun locked up, and you're liable for how other people use it if it's stolen from you. So it becomes more of a legal burden to own a gun than the potential for self-defense if somebody breaks into your home or is on your property, or, out here in the counties, wild animals. I mean, you never know. And it is about confiscation. It's a way to get to confiscation. The UN has talked about this, and the NRA has been calling it out for a long time. This isn't about common sense. And to see just how insane the rhetoric can get, even Snopes has at least partially verified this. And Snopes is notoriously a left-wing website anyway. So in November 2018, Democratic Representative Eric Swalwell suggested launching nuclear weapons against gun owners who refuse to hand over or sell semi-automatic rifles to the U.S. government. So they give it a mixture. What is true is, in a tweet on 16 November, Swalwell responded to a gun rights enthusiast who said the Democrats' proposal to confiscate or buy semi-automatic rifles would result in war due to resistance from gun owners, stating it would be a short war because the government has nukes. What I think this does is it underscores, obviously, I don't think anyone thinks he was seriously proposing the government launch nuclear weapons at gun-owning counties, but what it shows is the determination to use force in order to deprive people of their rights. But the question is, who's going to enforce this law? Is it going to be Eric Swalwell that's going to go knocking door to door? Or these liberals living in their condos in Seattle, are they going to go door to door? No, they're all going to sit at home and watch Stephen Colbert. They're going to go make other people do it. Well, who's going to do it? And the answer is, well, the sheriffs for one. And how are the sheriffs responding in Washington state? Here's an article by Daisy Luther via the Organic Prepper blog. So it's titled, The Real Resistance. Washington state sheriffs refuse to enforce unconstitutional gun laws. So, long thought to be the last line of defense between authoritarianism and freedom, sheriffs are in a unique position. As elected officials, basically nobody has authority over them. Not the judges, not the feds, no one except the people who may or may not choose to re-elect them. Here we talk a little bit more about the law itself, and so he points out things are getting more and more difficult for gun owners in a state that has two very different demographics. Washington is a reflection of the rest of the United States. The vast majority of the population lives in a few cities, distant from the rural and small town folks in a lot more than just mileage. The left-leaning cities are in direct opposition to the more right-leaning rural communities. But the rural communities are under the thumb of city voters due to numbers. So, when we voted on this, I-1639, 27 of the 39 counties were against the measure. But because the 12 counties that voted for it were more populous, the initiative passed. This sounds familiar to the election of Donald Trump. If it weren't for the Electoral College, Hillary Clinton would probably be our president. So the state is divided because the counties that voted against the measure are refusing to be governed by unconstitutional laws to which they objected in the first place, and they're supported by the sheriffs. So some Washington law enforcement officers are refusing to enforce these laws. And here's some specific individuals: Klickitat County Bob Songer, Republic Police Chief Lauren Culp, Ferry County Sheriff Ray Maycumber, and they've vowed they simply aren't going to enforce this law. In Ferry County in eastern Washington, more than 72% of the voters rejected it. In the county's only incorporated city, Republic, the police chief Lauren Culp asked the council in November to declare the city a Second Amendment sanctuary. And that's the first time I've heard that phrase. It seems we're going to really have the left versus right poles here are hardening. We're going to have sanctuary illegal alien cities. We're going to have Second Amendment sanctuaries, free speech zones. It's very bizarre, the fracturing of our society right now. So the sheriff in Ferry County told The Guardian he would not be enforcing the laws either. And they write, the refusal of law enforcement officers to enforce the new restrictions plays into a longer history of so-called constitutional sheriffs resisting the gradual tightening of gun laws, tightening leading to confiscation, I would argue. There are also hints in the stance of the doctrine of county supremacy, long nursed on the constitutionalist far right, which holds that county sheriffs are the highest constitutional authority in the country. So there is some pressure to get other counties to adopt this Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance. And this power that the sheriffs are exercising right here has actually been upheld in the past. There's a precedent. It was upheld in the Supreme Court in 1994 when Graham County, Arizona Sheriff Richard Mack and Ravalli County, Montana Sheriff Jay Prince sued the Clinton administration over the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. So, as far as the legal line of defense, the county sheriffs are it. When an unconstitutional law is passed, the left is still relying on these guys to go enforce it because they don't have any real power themselves. The next option, of course, would be widespread civil disobedience, which we recently saw in New Jersey, and I'll look at that as well. Let's see. There was a December 5th ruling. New Jersey's ban on gun magazines that hold more than 10 rounds took effect on December 10th. By that date, all owners of large capacity magazines were required to surrender them to police, render them inoperable, or modify them so they cannot hold more than 10 rounds. Those who failed to do so are guilty of a fourth-degree felony, punishable by $10,000 and 18 months in prison. How many of New Jersey's 1 million or so gun owners have complied with the ban? Approximately 0. So here's the article that goes into this a little bit more. Over 1 million U.S. owners refuse to obey the ban. So the sheriffs are not going to enforce unconstitutional laws. And even in states where the sheriffs may enforce it, people are simply refusing to comply, despite becoming overnight felons. Residents of New Jersey were given a deadline to turn in their gun magazines or become felons overnight. So far, no one is complying, and that's of this date, 12/24. So the citizens were given till December 11th on their new ban on standard capacity magazines, and it affected 1 million people if they failed to turn in these magazines. Somehow, New Jersey lawmakers thought insane individuals who want to carry out mass shootings would be lining up to turn in their 15-round magazines, as anyone caught with one of these magazines is now a felon, a fourth-degree felon. However, even law-abiding citizens are choosing to disobey. According to AmmoLand, who says they spoke with multiple police departments throughout the state, no one has turned in their magazines. So this act of disobedience is the only way law-abiding citizens can effectively and peacefully fight back against the gun grabbers. And so far it's been effective. So when you look at this and you look at the way the political winds are blowing, you might ask yourself, what is going on? You've got the left who's got these concentrated numbers in the city, and they're pushing and pushing and pushing to confiscate property from those in rural areas who value their freedom and want to protect their families and their property. And so you're seeing this resistance crop up, both the sheriffs and the individual citizens exercising their constitutional rights. And to put some perspective on this, I want to look at something Machiavelli wrote in his book, The Prince, over 500 years ago. And I think it highlights something that the globalists and the open borders and the gun confiscators, something they haven't considered, and why their plot to destroy the Constitution is essentially doomed. Machiavelli's writing to a potential prince, and he's informing them of the difficulties of conquering free republics. And I think this is why you've seen maybe globalism has been more successful in areas like Europe, but it's really struggled for a long time to take hold in the United States. So Machiavelli here writes, "Whoever becomes the master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed himself, because when there is a rebellion, such a city justifies itself by calling on the name of liberty and its ancient institutions, never forgotten, despite the passing of time and the benefits received from the new ruler. Whatever the conqueror's actions or foresight, if the inhabitants are not dispersed and scattered, they will forget neither that name nor those institutions, and at the first opportunity they will at once have recourse to them, as did Pisa after having been kept in servitude for 100 years by the Florentines. But when cities or provinces are used to living under a prince, and his family is wiped out, since on the one hand they are used to obeying, and on the other have lost their former prince, they cannot agree on a choice of a new prince from among themselves, and they cannot live in freedom without one. So they are slower to take up arms, and a prince can win them and assure himself of them more easily. But in republics, there is more life, more hatred, a greater desire for revenge. The memory of their ancient liberty does not and cannot let them rest."